I did not live there, but I spent 2 months helping my grandfather close up his second farm. He was in the process of selling the buildings and most of the land so that he could live full-time on his larger farm in Maine. They knew I was in need of work, and I immediately went from Baltimore to join them in my unreliable Ford Focus. The work was relaxed but monotonous from the start, mostly involving moving animals and their feed, loading up trailer after trailer with chickens, pigs, cows, and even a load of horses. This was my first job in some time dealing with livestock, and I was happy to be back caring for them. There is something simply wonderful about working with animals. You learn their personalities and quirks, and they never talk back to you. It is a fulfilling exchange and always gratifying at the end of the day to know they are all well cared for. Then, let us fast forward about a month. We had thankfully moved most of the animals when a tremendous blizzard struck. This was not just any blizzard. His property lay at the base of a gentle 2-meter slope. In snow country, these kinds of terrain features are problematic. The snow cascaded down the hillside in sheets until there was not enough left to slide. In some spots, the drifts were 20 feet high, as tall as 2 outlying barns and far taller than any of the stables or coops. We used barrels, burning wood, and tires to keep the space between the house and barn clear. We placed a blazing barrel every 8 feet or so and had to keep them burning because once the snow extinguished them, it was impossible to relight them. The entire barrel had to be replaced. Rolling around an 800-degree steel barrel is not as enjoyable as it might seem. The wind was harsher than anything I had ever experienced, and the family claimed they had not seen the likes of it in at least 50 years. Passing through a door that led outside required the use of both arms to thrust it open. We had to shield our eyes and faces because the wind could freeze the moisture in our eyes faster than we could blink. This happened to all of us, and it was one of the most indescribable pains of my life. My uncle and I took turns refilling a can of gas in the barn to keep the generators running. Frankly, the wood stoves and burning barrels were helpful, but it was the electricity that we truly needed. I felt as if I was living in another century, tirelessly working to keep everything operational, wondering when it would all end. There was nothing to do but focus on the work at hand. Not long into the blizzard, my uncle had an accident and broke his leg. He was out there alone when it happened, and I did not think to check on him until he failed to return with the gas. I wrapped myself up and battled the frost and wind until I reached the barn. Inside, I found him lying in the mud and ice. He had been yelling for help, but eventually realized that no one could hear him over the wind. He had no choice but to wait. I found him a walking stick and helped him back inside. Fortunately, his sister, my aunt, was there assisting with the move, and being a doctor, she managed to set his leg and splint it as best as she could. This accident meant that almost all the labor fell on me. I took on the task of collecting wood, filling all the barrels, and stocking up the house. I carried armloads back and forth until I could not continue. The ice began to coat my eyes and mouth. I would thaw by the fire for 5 minutes before returning to my tasks. We needed more than just wood. We needed gasoline. I made 3 more trips to fetch a total of 6 gallons of gas before I had to stop. We were stocked for half an evening, but my fingers and toes were at risk of frostbite. I was unwilling to sacrifice any part of my body for the hourly wage they were paying me. Then, my grandfather asked me for a favor. 1 more trip to the barn to ensure everything was properly sealed. I was still warming up by the fire, but I agreed and went back into the storm. It had begun to snow again, piling up in 20-foot drifts that loomed over the property like great white giants. When I reached the barn, everything seemed in order. The fuel line was shut, the lights were off, and nothing seemed out of place. However, I noticed an eerie silence. Oddly, I could not hear the wind against the roof or the back wall. It had been howling for a day and a half, maybe 2 days, and yet, despite the visible signs of the wind's presence, There was no sound. I thought perhaps I was experiencing symptoms of hypothermia, or maybe something worse was happening, as my nervous system seemed to be shutting down one sense at a time. Suddenly, my eyes began to deceive me. The joints in the structure seemed to twist and lean, and I stared in confusion, reminiscent of an acid flashback. I was convinced something was amiss with my brain. I had heard of heat stroke, so I wondered if there might be such a thing as a cold stroke. Then I heard a noise at last, something that sounded normal though it was not. It was a pop, a chirp, or maybe a snap. Something quick and loud. Looking back at the walls, I saw the joists were now still, but the boards were rippling. A window shattered above me, and it became clear what was happening. The wind was silent, because the snow had entirely covered the barn. The drifts had piled up so high and so thick that they blocked any lighter wind from reaching it. Now, all that weight began to shift, and the barn was succumbing to it. The structure was seconds from collapsing. I left everything as it was and dashed to the exit. I dove through, landing hard on the ice, and skated on my chest to one of the burning barrels. I turned around just in time to see a 40-foot snowdrift wipe the barn from existence. I had expected a massive sound, but the snow's insulation kept it relatively quiet. My grandfather could not believe it when I went inside and told him. We were all in disbelief 30 minutes later, when the sun emerged and began to clear the clouds. That was the last winter job I ever took on. I was driving up to a ski hill after a snowstorm, not having a great amount of money at the time, so I hadn't invested in winter tires. Anyone who lives in a snowy region knows the value of these things. They can get an average vehicle out of a less than desirable situation. They aren't going to get you anywhere, but they'll keep you out of the ditches if you're careful. There's a tractor trailer in front of me, a car to my left, and another car behind. This is almost the worst place a driver can be during snowy driving. My car was at the nexus of any trouble that was going to happen, so I did my best to stay sharp and focused. After a while, though, I started to zone out. It's natural for us once we get relaxed and comfortable. Nothing chaotic had happened for a good 20 minutes or so, and I just chilled out like anyone does as they're driving. Something shifted in the passenger seat, so I took my eyes off the road for a moment. I'm talking about a split-second correction. I didn't even have to reach over or move anything. It didn't matter. Snow is merciless. Without the snow tires, my bald little city slickers were out of control instantly. I'd only made it as far as I did because I was following the trailer tracks in front of me. Just the faintest amount of slush sent me sailing over a crash course first towards certain death. The right wheels crossed over into the shoulder and lost traction. The car drifted to the right onto the shoulder. I was hoping this would be the end of the situation, crash into the guardrail, sustain some body damage, and get my dumbass back on the road. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than spinning out. I took my foot off the gas and just tried to coast. No brakes, just open steering. Applying either pedal would have contributed to the chaos and lack of control, sending me into a collision at a faster speed. I would have gone into that guardrail, but the snow had piled up against it, forming a natural curb that my car bounced off. I stared in pure shock and terror as the visuals before me started to turn the other direction. I passed through those tracks that I was following, but I didn't have the reaction time to pull out of the slide. Between my lack of reacting and the impact of the snowdrift, my car, still without proper traction, started naturally drifting left. The truck ahead of me began to slow, but I didn't want to brake for fear of losing what traction I had. Now there's the option of potentially slamming into the back of his trailer, going through the windshield, and maybe even getting decapitated. My car makes its way sideways across the lane, and I prepare for whatever's going to happen when I sideswipe the vehicle one lane over. We didn't make contact, but I cut sharply into his lane before sliding back into mine. We came within inches of touching fenders, but he had a more equipped rig and was able to maneuver away from me. The humiliation of almost killing a stranger, and maybe even his family, brought me back into the moment. Just as I hit the center of the lane, my tires managed to grip the road again, and I resumed moving straight forward. I tapped my brakes at this point to prevent myself from rear-ending the truck, which was now right in my face. The car seemed to be under my control again and even resumed accelerating through the snow. It feels like an eternity typing it all out like this, but the whole event couldn't have taken more than a few seconds. Car collisions have an uncanny way of dilating time and stretching events out into the longest possible form. It has something to do with the real-time reaction to those events as they happen and watching them either improve or worsen in rapid fashion. In the end, the only thing that my car made contact with, other than the road, was that snowbank, and that didn't even leave a mark. I escaped very, very luckily, and was as grateful as I could be. It really could have gone south, not just for me, but for those other drivers. If I had killed someone else, it would have affected me forever. And yes, when I got home from the ski hill, I bought myself some snow tires and haven't gone without them since that trip. This incident occurred when I was 15 near Elgin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I was always amazed by the beauty of that park and had grown up enjoying its splendor every single summer. The cottage was situated on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. During the summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. As it was cottage country, people spent their time enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with their family and friends. I spent every summer there growing up, creating fond memories of sunshine, laughter, and the sounds of motorboats on the lake. However, winters were different. Those who didn't live there year-round would return to city life, leaving the area mostly deserted with cottages boarded up for the winter. A few people still frequented the area every couple of months, but for the most part, the lake was silent during winters, and the town was filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees were always covered with snow, making the forest quiet. Our cottage was on a dead-end road with about 20 other cottages on the road, ours being somewhat in the middle. Despite being spaced out, our closest neighbors were too far away to see through the trees. My dad needed to head up to the cottage to do some painting, a task my mom had been urging him to complete. This was at the end of February, during a long weekend, and I tagged along to keep him company and spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive from home, but it turned out to be an 8-hour drive due to heavy snowfall. It had gotten dark quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through the park. It was eerily quiet and pitch black, except for the headlights of the car. We finally passed through the park with only 30 minutes left to get to the cottage. It had stopped snowing, and we were both eager to get there. As we turned onto the familiar road, I remember my dad cursing. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising. It probably wouldn't be until later that day when we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the road, I noticed fresh tire tracks. The Smiths must be up for the weekend, my dad said. All of a sudden, as we followed the tire tracks around a bend, the headlights illuminated a white van parked on the side of the road. It was almost hidden by the vast trees covered with snow. "What the?" my dad mumbled as we drove past that white van. I looked back through the back window and clearly saw 2 figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. I told my dad this, and he shrugged. "Maybe they're lost." I nodded, but I couldn't help thinking about how it was a dead-end road. Why would they feel the need to park right there? As we pulled into our driveway and started bringing our stuff in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about the van and why it was there with 2 people just sitting in the dark in the middle of the night. It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him instead of downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds, looking out into the blackness of that forest, and my 15-year-old self was already scared of the dark, even without seeing that white van. It wasn't that big of a deal when my sister was there, but not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned off all the lights, and I was using a small lamp next to the couch to get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet that I could almost hear my ears ringing. I also started to get the feeling that I was being watched. The living room had 2 large windows with no curtains, overlooking the lake. It was pitch black, except for a light or two from the cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now that the cottage was dark, the moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was beautiful. I walked toward the window to get a better look. Movement caught my eye, and I remember my heart dropping as I saw 2 figures down by the back porch below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I immediately dropped to the floor and crawled toward the bedroom where my dad was. He was sleeping, and my heart was in my throat. I wasn't sure if they'd see me or not yet. I woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the 2 figures were gone. Where I had seen those figures, 2 sets of footprints were in the snow, leading back to the front of the cottage and then back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare them off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I remember being very freaked out, and I lay there all night next to my dad. Terrified, I'd look out the window and see someone staring right back at me. The next morning, my dad went outside and confirmed there were 2 sets of footprints leading from the road behind our cottage, and then back around the front of the cottage and then back up to the road. There were tire marks that showed the vehicle had turned around and then got back up to the main road. My dad guessed they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff. As it was the middle of winter, not too many people were up at the lake, but they knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading to our cottage, my dad's car parked out front. They also had to have seen the lamp I turned on to read and/or seeing it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to any of this, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently, there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from other cottages that were boarded up for the winter. But again, I still wonder to this day, why would they be interested in stealing from a house that clearly had people still inside?